Yeah?
Go.
Okay, well, here we go. We're starting something new because we just came to the end of the other one. So what we are going to talk about this time is the book of Titus. Okay, Titus. So what we're doing right now is a big intro. We're going to do an introduction to it. Okay, big intro to Titus. I want to make sure that we understand what's going on. When we did 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, we went through a big thing on trying to figure out what Timothy, what was the players and the places and things like that. And I want to do the same thing with this because I want us to be able to understand the areas and the people that we're talking about. When we were talking about Timothy, we were talking about Asia Minor right here. We were talking about the Ephesus, and we were talking about some of the things that went on in Ephesus and some of the challenges that were there. Well, now that we're shifting from Timothy to Titus, we have to look at that whole piece of the puzzle so that we can understand who Titus is and the purpose of the letter and where he is and all that kind of stuff. Okay? So, when Paul wrote Titus, okay, he was writing, when Paul wrote to Titus, not Titus, when he wrote to Titus, I should say, because this, once again, is a letter to Titus. When Paul wrote to Titus, okay, he had experienced a lot of different stuff in his Christian service. There were times that he was looked at as a god because of the stuff he could do and the authority in which he spoke, which he hated. There were times when he was looked at as a heretic and a criminal, which actually he liked those times more, which is weird. But we see that he had all kinds of different things that are going on, lots of different victories, lots of different tragedies. We see that after 25 years of work in the field, I guess you could say 25 years of work in Paul's ministry at this time, all right, by the time Titus is written, more or less, we see that he could easily, you ever met a guy that does like racing or anything like that? There's or any kind of like sporting event like football or something like that. I know it's part of soccer. Like I can look at, I don't know if you know this, but or if you've done this or whatever, but I have like scars on my body in different places. Like I've got scars on my knees. I have a scar on my, I got a scar here on my head right there. And it doesn't show up very well, but which makes me a little sad because it would have been a really cool scar. But you can point to those things, and I can tell you why I got that scar. I got a scar right here, and I did it playing soccer, right? And there's a whole story that goes with that. How I went up for a header, and I got the ball, and some guy actually headed me and knocked me down. I was bleeding and everything. There's a big story that goes along with it. You know what I mean? But I think we could do that. And I think Paul could probably do that too. Paul is, he's gone through a lot of emotional things, physical things. He could probably point to a scar on his body and go, man, you remember when I got this type of thing, and he's got a story with that. Well, Titus could probably know those stories and maybe be able to finish these stories because Titus was a guy that actually traveled in ministry with Paul for many, many years. Let me see if I can... So if you're looking at, let me try and get a perspective here, I guess you could say. We're at 55 AD, maybe 60 AD, maybe 65 AD. That might be a large enough span, I guess you could say. So by 55 AD, Paul is doing his Paul third missionary journey. Oh, I should put missionary journey. Missions journey. Yeah, I'm going to run out of room. So here we have Paul's third missionary journey, right? Now, when we get closer to 60 here, that is when Paul was Paul's arrest. This is the first one. Okay, first one. Paul's arrest was around right before 60. I don't have space over there because I wrote too big there. But before, by 60 A.D., all right, Paul was released, I guess you could say, from his first incarceration. Now, if you remember, when we were doing 1 Timothy, okay, Paul had been released from his first incarceration, right? He was released from his first incarceration, and when he did, he decided to go through a lot of these churches here. He spent a couple years going through these churches. If you remember right, he went through Asia Minor and was going through those churches. And if you remember, he met with, in Maltus, he met with Timothy. And Timothy was the pastor in Ephesus, which those are right near each other, right? So he came down, he met with Timothy, yeah. And then went up, and as he was going into Macedonia, he heard that Timothy was having like some problems in the church. So that's when he wrote 1 Timothy, right? So right after, like about 60 AD is when Paul's arrest was. And then it was after that. He was arrested about 60 AD. He didn't get out of his incarceration until maybe a couple of years later. So he was arrested in 60, and then he got out a few years later, all right? And then once he got out, he started doing some plans. By the time he got to 65, so like 1 Timothy was written like right around here, and Titus was written right after it. Okay, if that makes sense to you. Okay, and then Paul was arrested again. Paul was arrested again somewhere in that ballpark. So this is a kind of a loose kind of a timeline, okay? But I'm just telling you that because we did a study on 1 Timothy and then we did a study on 2 Timothy. So by the time 2 Timothy was written, probably Timothy was written like around this time, okay? After his second arrest, right? So that's kind of the timeline that we're looking at here, so that we understand. So if you are looking at 1 Timothy, if you remember 1 Timothy, he got done with his third missionary journey, he gets arrested, he's in jail, gets arrested, and he's out. He gets out. All right? He gets out. All right? And then after he gets out, that's when he took a couple years, he gets out and he starts going through these churches here in Asia Minor, where we were at before, right? And then as he goes up through into Macedonia, as he's starting to round the corner into Macedonia, that's when he finds out that Timothy's having some issues. That's when he writes 1 Timothy. Shortly after that, he writes Titus, okay? And then 2 Timothy is further down after he gets arrested again the second time, okay? So if you're looking at the timeline, I'm just trying to paint a picture for you as to where we are in the 1 and the 2 Timothy span, because we did studies on both of those books, right? All right? Nero's persecution really kicked in right here at about 65 AD, and that was shortly after that's when he got arrested again. You know what I mean? That's when Nero really ramped up his persecution of the Christians. You know what I mean? So that type of a thing. All right? So anyway, that's just kind of give you paint a little picture for you there, okay? So anyway, when it comes to ministry, though, Paul understood what the cost of ministry was. Of course, he's been on several missionary journeys. He's been arrested a couple of times. There's been all kinds of things that he did, but he had experienced, of course, the ups and the downs of ministry, and in doing that, man, when you look at what Paul had to go through in ministry, if I was Paul, who knows, I might have gone running back to my tent making job and just kept my head down, you know what I mean? Tent making was a respectable business back then, people needed tents and stuff like that. That was a respectable business, basically like building a house, that travels with you, so I mean, that's a respectable job. But he doesn't. He, of course, goes through it. We've talked about how he's experienced, when he had that big falling out with, like Barnabas in Acts 15, over Mark, you know what I mean? Because he fought with Mark. We talked about that last time, you know what I mean, when we talked about Mark. And he considered Barnabas like a mentor kind of a scenario type of a thing. He got into his his first journey with Barnabas, and that was really, Barnabas was a really important guy with him. So he's felt the joy of having this mentor with him, and of course the heartbreak of getting into kind of a fight with him about ministry and stuff like that. He went to the Jerusalem Council. And he went to the Jerusalem Council to talk about his ministry as an apostle, and submitted to them, kind of to their authority type of a thing, and they recognized him as an apostle. But then eventually, like in Galatians 2, he had to fight with Peter. Peter was like one of the main guys, right? He was one of the main lead apostles to the Jews, and he had to rebuke Peter because in Galatians 2, he came to visit some of the people in the area of Galatia, and they were all Gentile Christians, and Peter was super cool with it until some Jewish guys showed up, and Peter was like, oh, I don't want to be seen with these Jewish people. I'm a Jew, and I don't want to be seen with these Gentile people, because that wasn't cool back in those days, because there were Jews and everybody else that wanted to be Jews. You know what I mean? So you didn't really hang out with each other. And that's when Paul stepped up and yelled at Peter and goes, you got to be kidding me, right? We're all Christians here. How can you sit there and look down at them because they have the same belief you do? It's a whole different ballgame. And Peter knew that better than anybody, because Peter was the guy who was the first guy to lead a Gentile to Christ. So, it was kind of, Paul had lots of ups and downs. Of course, he had lots of kids that he mentored, or people that he mentored. Titus, of course, Timothy, Luke, Priscilla and Aquila we talked about. Mark, Silas. I mean, there are lots of people that he took under his wing. Yeah.
Yeah. With John Mark that was with Barnabas, is he the same Mark that wrote the Gospel of Mark?
Yep.
Okay.
He is.
And I just gotta say this. I would love to have been there when
Peter and Paul were at it.
Going at it. I would love to have heard that.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you just kind of, when the mirror is shown to your face, you kind of go, yeah. I think that I can kind of picture Peter kind of going, was one of those things. But anyway, we've talked a lot about, how he's talked to a lot of people, mentored a lot of people. At the end of a couple of his letters, he's mentioned some people by name, and things like that. But for every Timothy and Titus that he mentioned, we also know that he mentioned like Demas and Alexander, and people that were against him, people that were with him, people were against him, people that might have been in ministry and then abandoned the ministry, people that didn't like the ministry at all. For every up there was a down, you know what I mean? So the guy understands that, and he understands the ebbs and the flows. But we need to understand that during a vast majority of that, Titus was with him, okay? And that's a part of the puzzle that we need to make sure that we understand, because as Paul, just as Timothy was with Paul during many years during his ministry, Titus was also. So when we read through Titus, you're going to see how Paul refers to things to Titus that these guys would know. You get what I'm saying? Just like he did with Timothy. You know what I mean? We're reading it 2,000 years later, so it's, we got to kind of figure stuff out. But to them, it would have been like, oh yeah, you know what I'm saying? So just kind of keeping that. That's why I usually don't give you like a little timeline, but I did that just so that you can kind of wrap your head around when we're talking about here. And this is a long time ago. It's the first century. You know what I mean? So this is a long time ago. Titus. I'll tell you a little about Titus. Titus was a unique guy. He was, when Paul wrote this letter to Titus, Titus was in Crete. Whoa. What am I, an idiot? No. There's Crete. Oh my goodness. It's a little island.
It's south of Greece.
Yeah, it's, why can I not find it? I'm an idiot. Oh my gosh, this is sad. It's a little island just south of, yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's just south of Greece. I don't know why I can't find it. It's in here. So anyway, it's an island, okay? It's an island. And Timothy was one of Paul's. Timothy probably hooked up with Paul and traveled with Paul during his first missionary journey, okay? And so he'd been with Paul for a while, okay? Probably around like 48 AD, like back in, way earlier. So he had been traveling with Paul for quite some time. He doesn't really get talked about too much. He does get referenced to, okay? There is references to Titus in a couple of places, but not a lot of full-on stuff. So somewhere around 46
to
probably
48.
Yeah, but I'm saying he probably hooked up with them during the end of his first.
Barnabas and Mark.
Right, during the end of his first journey. So yeah, somewhere around 48. Oh, you have a little man. Oh, look at that. That's so nice. But yeah, during his first missionary journey, towards the end of that, when he started going off on his own, that's probably when Titus joined in with Paul. And he'd been with him for a long time, okay? His name, Titus's name, means honorable, okay? And he was the prime example, okay, of the time. He was the prime example of how a Gentile can become a follower of Yahweh, of the Messiah, all right, of Christ, without becoming a Jew first, okay? And that's a big deal as we get into the book of Titus, okay? And what he had to go through that, and all the training that he went through with Paul, and all this kind of stuff really helped him as he got into the island of Crete. So let me see. Crete is right here. Oh, it's right here. I'm an idiot. It's right there. Okay, Crete's right there. It's a big old island right there. So anyway, but he's a really honorable guy. His name literally means honorable, and he is the perfect example of how a Gentile can become a follower of Christ without becoming a Jew. Okay, now the earliest converts, I should say, to Christianity came through the door of Judaism, kind of, because the Jews got the law. The Jews had been doing the law for, 1,500 years or so. They had been doing all this stuff in the Old Testament. After Jesus came and presented himself as Messiah, and he died and he rose again, that basically started off a whole new program and a whole new covenant. And there were a lot of people that said, basically, if you want to get involved in the new covenant, well, you got to fulfill the old covenant before you can get into the new covenant. You know what I mean? You got to read this. You got to do this before you can get this. It's like going to college. You got to take the 101 course before you can take the 201 course or the 202 course. You know, there's a prerequisite type of a thing. And that was kind of the mentality then. And those people were called, after a while, those people were called Judaizers, okay? These Judaizers argued that Gentiles needed to do stuff first that was part of the old covenant before they could partake in the new covenant. And there were many reasons why they did that. They did that because they wanted to substantiate their own belief system. They did that because they wanted to make themselves still pertinent. This whole new covenant that came along with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ changed everything. You know what I mean? One of the biggest things that came along that was a big issue is circumcision. That was like the biggest thing, okay, that came along was circumcision. The issue of Christian circumcision became the first doctrinal error that threatened the gospel in the churches back in those days. Because a lot of Gentiles, Paul was talking to these Gentiles, he was preaching to these Gentiles. Whenever Paul would go into a new city, he'd always go to the Jews first, just to tell them the whole good news of Jesus Christ. But he'd also go to the Gentiles equally. He would just go to the Jews first until the Jews rejected Christ altogether. But this whole concept of circumcision was a big thing. Circumcision was a right that was given to the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament people, as a sign that you are, that you're Jewish and that you're part of that whole program and stuff like that. And if you wanted to become a follower of Yahweh, you needed to first go through the Jewish stuff. You had to go through the Jewish door before you could get to where you needed to go. Well, now with this new covenant, everything had changed. All right? All these Gentiles across the Roman Empire, these Gentile churches are starting to sprout up and all this stuff. So Paul and Barnabas agree to join this contingent of Judaizers as they go to Jerusalem so that he can plead his case and tell them about the gospel apart from the old covenant. And he introduced the testimony of Titus as a Gentile and a Christian whose stature put a lot of the Jews to shame. You know what I mean? And he went and did this, and he used Titus as an example, which is kind of saying something about Titus, okay? Several years, like around 56 AD, Paul began receiving reports, bad reports, I guess you could say, as he's out in Ephesus doing his thing, that the church in Corinth is doing some crazy stuff, okay? He established this church in Corinth, and as he's out there in Ephesus kind of helping them and doing a thing out there, he hears that Corinth is doing some crazy things out there. He doesn't want to leave Ephesus because he's there trying to help substantiate things and get Timothy up and running there in that place. So Paul writes him a letter, which is 1 Corinthians, kind of a sternish kind of letter, 1 Corinthians. He writes him that letter, and then he does a visit there in person, and Paul sends Titus. Paul sends Titus to deliver an even stronger letter. We don't actually have that letter. I think that letter is referred to us as we looked at before in our 2 Timothy study. But we don't actually have that letter. But he is writing these letters to them to try and get them squared away in Corinth, right? So while they're having these problems, Paul sends Titus there. So Titus, he goes there to Corinth, and he kind of stays there, and he helps them by Paul's direction. He brings them these letters and try and get them on track, and then he stays there and tries to help them because he had traveled around with Paul for a long time. And Titus became almost kind of like a fixer. You know what I mean? He kind of became kind of like a fixer for churches, like hard down on their luck, kind of following, getting off track kind of churches. Paul would send Titus there. He kind of got that kind of reputation. So here we see he goes in to Corinth. He goes there. He brings the word. He stays there, gets some help, and he actually does. He actually helps them. And the Corinthian believers, confront the false teachers and stuff in their midst and stuff, and they get back on track, and they are listening to Paul, and they're getting everything back on track. Unfortunately, they were a little too loosey-goosey, and then they became a little bit too strict about some things, and that opened the door for these Judaizers to kind of come in there and kind of mess with them a little bit. So Titus would go back there and help them and get them all situated, and a lot of it revolved around this circumcision kind of a thing. And then Titus kind of helped fix that situation. So Titus kind of proved himself so faithful in difficult assignments that he was kind of the fixer. So not only do we know that Titus was in Corinth, but we also know when this letter was written, he was in Crete. And we also know at the end of 2 Timothy that he sent Titus to up here, to Dalmatia, whatever. And we talked about that a little bit, about how that was kind of a crazy place. They were the place that didn't really want to follow the Roman rules, and they were a haven for pirates and things like that. Remember I talked about that? Well, Paul sent Titus there to try and help that church. Titus was kind of like the fixer guy. He'd go in there, and he was the guy to lay down the gospel and really adhere to things and get going. So we know that this Titus guy was the guy that Paul used to kind of help some of these struggling churches and stuff. So Titus was a really good example of what needed to be done, and he was the guy that could easily get it done. If there was a struggling church, that sometimes that's where Titus would go. So Paul describes Timothy as being enthusiastic in 2 Corinthians 8. He talks about him being motivated by love in 2 Corinthians 7. He talks about him being sensitive and stable in 2 Corinthians 12. He calls Titus a true child of a common faith here in the book of Titus here. He calls him a brother in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. He calls him a partner and a fellow worker in 2 Corinthians 8. All of these qualities, along with the confidence of his mentor, made Timothy the ideal guy to go to Crete to kind of help them. And I'll tell you why, because we'll talk about Crete here a little bit, depending on if we have time. Do we have time? I think we have time. Oh, we got time. Okay, we can talk about Crete. Okay, so does anybody have any thoughts or comments so far? I know I'm just kind of giving you an overview, and that's the whole point of this. I talked a little bit about Paul's relationship with Titus, and now I've kind of laid out who Titus is and the kind of guy that Titus is, and all that kind of stuff. We see a lot of references once again to Titus in 2 Corinthians, because once again he was the guy that delivered that message, that second message to Corinth, and stayed there to try and help them and get them squared away, right? So here we see that that's why he's referred to a lot in that. All right. Any thoughts, comments, observations? Anything your little math tells you? I'm just kidding. All right. So here we go. First encounter with Crete. Okay. So this is why if Titus is the fixer and he's sent to Crete, then if you're putting 2 and 2 together, then Crete must have been like a crazy place. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? Or not crazy place, but they must have been off track. If Titus was that fixer guy that Paul would send, then it makes sense that Crete might have been one of those places. And it was. first encounter Paul had with the people of Crete was when he was being transported to Caesar, right? Remember his first incarceration, when he was the ideal person to be the spokesperson for the Gentiles, because he was Jewish, but he also had Roman citizenship because of his parents. One of his parents was Roman, one of his parents was Jewish, and he had the ability to become a Pharisee, to be educated as a Pharisee, but he also had Roman citizenship and stuff like that. So when you had Roman citizenship, you could request the audience of, Caesar and stuff like that. You could have your due process, like we like to do nowadays in actual democracies. So he was on his way to Rome for his audience with Caesar, or with that tribunal. And if you know the story in Acts 27, you'll know that there was a strong wind that forced the ship to travel along the southern coast, and they stopped in Crete there. All right? And eventually, as they were leaving Crete, if you remember the story, they stopped in Crete. They were there for a while, and then the crew said, well, we got to get out of here before, like the bad weather comes. And Paul warns them, don't do that. You got to stay here a little bit longer, wait it out. And they don't, and then, of course, they get shipwrecked. I mean, the ship gets capsized, if you remember that story from Sunday school, your little Sunday school classes and stuff. But we know, Acts 27, here, that he was traveling along, and they had to stop here at Crete. Now, when they stopped at Crete, even though Paul was under arrest, they actually gave Paul a lot of leeway. All right, Crete's not a huge place, but it is, fairly decent in size. And they gave Paul the opportunity to kind of roam freely and do ministry, okay, on the island of Crete. Maybe they figured he can't get off there anyway, so they just let him do it. I don't know. But the island of Crete was, Paul was actually there and was able to do a little bit of ministry before they took off. The island of Crete heard about Christ from Jewish pilgrims and stuff. People would come, when people were traveling through, they would always, people could easily stop at Crete, because it was an island just south of the Aegean Sea, and it was kind of a stopping place before you get into what we know as Greece today, but isn't now. Or before you get in, before you start moving a little bit more to the west. So lots of people coming and going. They heard about Christ from a lot of the Jewish pilgrims that came through. They heard about the amazing stories that happened in Pentecost. So they were, they had heard about all these different things. The problem is that they didn't have anybody to kind of give them like any kind of instruction or any kind of teaching. You know what I mean? They heard about all this cool stuff that was happening, but they never really had an instructor or a teacher, and they never had the word to be able to do what they needed to do. So they didn't have that. So when Paul was there, he was allowed to be able to do this, and he was allowed to be able to talk to people and get some stuff. And unfortunately, the people that lived here didn't have the same benefit as the mainland people. When Paul, what did Paul do when he first got out of, when he was arrested the first time? What did he do? Instantly, he went to go visit these churches on the mainland. You know what I mean? And as he's doing that, he's writing letters to other people and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But Crete still didn't have that benefit of, like the people in the mainland did. So that's why, like right after 1 Timothy was written, when he was crossing over into Macedonia, and he heard that Timothy was having problems, he also wrote to Titus shortly after that. Okay? They had kind of certain beliefs, like you do with a port city. You got lots of people coming in and out, lots of people with different ideas and philosophies and thoughts and stuff like that. They didn't have real kind of teaching or anything like that. So Paul, tried to set some of that groundwork, I think, and that kind of a thing. Paul probably returned to Crete after a while, sometime after his arrest, to resume kind of teaching and and stuff like that. And we believe that Timothy was with us. Why do we believe that? Well, if you look at Titus chapter 1, verse 5, it says, "For this reason I left you in Crete." Okay? He says, I left you there. He didn't say, I sent you there. And first he sent him to Corinth, and he sent him to this area up in here. You know what I mean? He sent him to these places, but here he says, I left you there. So he probably returned back over there and to try and help stabilize some things, and he left Titus there to, further the groundwork and further the ministry there and stuff like that, okay? So he left him there on the island of Crete to kind of take care of some business, and he gave him, the instructions and stuff like that. Titus knew what was going on. Titus had been traveling with him for a long time during his missionary journeys and stuff and things like that. So yeah, he found his home there to try and stabilize the region or the island of Crete and get some stuff going there. So he worked, the island of Crete itself kind of had a reputation of being, I don't know, kind of a bunch of uneducated hillbillies, I guess you could say. I don't know how else to say it. The island was, it was thought of as not having a lot of culture, not a lot of, not, kind of lazy, kind of stuff like that. It had a bad reputation like that. So they sent Timothy, this guy, really high energy, to go in there and, get some stuff done. Titus went in there to the church in Crete. He got it. It was organized. It was disorganized, so he got in there and just started tearing into it and stuff like that. Okay. We are out of time. It's 10:30. I will tell you guys. I will start with the rest of our introduction to tell you about the book itself, and then we will get into the book. Okay? So the reason for the letter to Titus, there's basically two reasons for the letter to Titus, and we'll talk about that next time in the conclusion of our introduction, and then we'll get right into it. Okay? The book of Titus isn't actually very long. It's only 3 chapters, so it's not super long. But in those 3 chapters, we're going to see a lot of familiar stuff that we hear from 1 Timothy and even a little bit from 2 Timothy. Okay? Any thoughts, comments, observations? No? I know this is kind of boring with the introduction part, but we'll get into it, I promise. All right? Let's go ahead and we'll pray and we'll get going here to what's happening. So, dear Lord, thank you for this time that we can open up your word and just kind of gain perspective on the book of Titus. Help us to truly honor and glorify you in that, and knowing that this guy Titus really was a good guy. He was an honorable man, worked hard for you to spread the gospel, and that we can actually learn a lot from what Paul tells to him and encourages a guy like this to keep the ministry going and whatnot. So, dear Lord, help us to truly honor and glorify you as we go into this study, and help us to open our hearts and minds to our church service as we continue our sermon series on doors. And we ask this in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Okay.